Okay, good morning. Thank you. Welcome. Today we're going to talk about health tech, health technology. Recent advances in health technology have led to better detection, prevention, and treatment through less invasive procedures. Health tech as a sector is poised to improve the lives of millions. Today we have a panel of experts, a very diverse panel that comes to the area of health tech. And we are going to discuss the technologies and the future technologies and what's out there today and what the investment opportunities are in this exciting new area of health tech. The interesting thing about health tech is it incorporates a lot of the technologies that we've already described, just focusing them on a particular industry. So during our webinar today, we have 4 excellent presenters. If you have questions, you'll notice that there's a dialog box on your screen. So go ahead to the question box, type in your question. We'll get to them before the end of the webinar, and if we don't, we'll follow up with you afterwards. This webinar is being recorded. You'll be able to access the webinar and the materials after the webinar on the Royse University site, the Royse Law Firm YouTube page, as well as a podcast for download on the iTunes Store. So with that, I would like to briefly introduce our panelists, and then I'm going to turn it over to them to give you a short introduction to the subject. Carla Brenner is the co-founder of HealthTech Women. It's now an international organization of over 4,000 professional members, which has hosted more than 50 female speakers across the world, really. San Francisco, Silicon Valley, Las Vegas, London, New York. Although it's headquartered here in San Francisco, and Carla is one of the co-founders, rapidly growing organization that has conducted a series of events around women in health tech. And I'd like to remind everybody that to please mute your phones if you're not yet speaking so we don't pick up any background noise. Farmanfarmaian is a very well-known medical futurist, entrepreneur, now a best-selling author, a speaker, and a technologist, and she's also been a patient with a deep understanding of the convergence of accelerating technology and how that is impacting and disrupting every industry, including the health industry. She's a very frequent keynote speaker on this topic, and also has been a startup entrepreneur, a founder, an advisor, and a member of the board of a nonprofit, the Organ Preservation Alliance. And she comes to us today to talk about the future of health tech. Don Ross is the managing partner of digital health at Life Science Angels. He's also a member of Sierra Angels, a member and former board member of Sandhill Angels, and co-founder of HealthTech Capital. Don has been in the healthcare field for more than 35 years and has an interest in digital health and software, and comes to us as our venture capital panelist today to talk about the opportunities and what is fundable and what's being funded and where the opportunities are for startup entrepreneurs. And finally, Andy Bartley is a senior solutions architect in the Health and Life Sciences Group at Intel Corporation in Portland. He works with providers, payers, life science organizations, and government agencies around the world on the development and implementation of leading-edge collaborative care and distributed care solutions. So with that, Carla, if you're ready, we're going to go ahead and turn the controls over to you and let you give us a short introduction to the topic and how you come to it and the role of HealthTech Women in this.
Great, thanks. Well, I first want to thank you and Royse Law Firm for putting together such a wonderful panel in health technology. I know you've been a great friend of mine and a huge supporter of HealthTech Women for over the years, so I'm looking forward to this panel discussion. I know you did a brief introduction, but kind of as a way of additional introduction, I'm the founder of HealthTech Women, a global nonprofit that started 4 years ago in San Francisco. Slight correction, we have about 13,000 members now internationally. We're focused on engaging, educating, and supporting women leaders across the healthcare ecosystem. Our aim is really to accelerate knowledge and resources for impacting and changing technologies in healthcare. I'm also on the healthcare team here at Salesforce, working specifically with payers and providers on our newest product called the Health Cloud. So I've been in healthcare for about 10 years now, starting in pharma. later joined a couple early stage technology companies, and now part of a large technology organization that recently took a bet on creating a first verticalized product in healthcare. This is certainly a great time, and I'll bet the best time to be in healthcare, not only as innovators, but also as consumers that are really empowered and ready to take action. So empowered consumers now have more information at their fingertips that can be used when purchasing healthcare through real-time health insights, and ease of navigating the health system now is easier and easier. So the transformation in healthcare is happening, and it's really just the beginning. When I started in this space about 10 years ago, it was very siloed, this industry, from pharma, med device, life sciences, healthcare technology, and now there's this real shift going on between the intersection of these different, as I call them, verticals in the healthcare space. I'm now seeing more of an open mind for decision makers to make an impact and to really change this space. So as we go to this next slide, as I think about key trends happening in this space, you know, I believe it comes down to open minds of healthcare decision makers to impact change and incentives from the government, such as the Healthcare Information Act, Genomic and Personalized Medicine Act, and others. Today, just briefly, I know we only have about 10 minutes here, but for each of us to really hone in on a few key trends, but here are a few things that I want to hone in over the next 10 minutes or so. So the first is the empowered patient. I believe that the biggest transformation in the last 5 years, and that will continue over the next couple of years, is that people or patients want to have access to more of their health data than ever before. The thing of the past really will be when a doctor's hours determine when treatment gets delivered. So the future of healthcare is now driven by consumers and how they want to access care. Why do I think this? Well, consumers are generating more data at their fingertips through these connected devices such as Fitbit and Jawbone and others. There's an increased cost transparency. So now you can get the exact cost on different types of procedures. You can determine what hospitals are less and more expensive. You can even rank physicians. So consumers can make more informed decisions based on these transparent costs. And then social is really the first line of attack for information for consumers. They'll go online, search for information. And there's a push towards the empowered patient through this value-based model, so a huge shift towards outcomes-based medicine versus fee-for-service. So as the shift is pushed by patients, there actually is an additional pressure on the overall healthcare system. The biggest issue with this shift is that providers don't actually have the infrastructure and true incentives to support the patient's demand. So providers are now finally understanding, in order to retain patients and maintain a solid customer satisfaction score, they must put the technology and procedures in place to support the demands driven by these patients or consumers. Providers are only pushed by either governmental incentives or financial incentives to change habits. However, if they don't change with the demands, patients will go elsewhere. Due to these pressures, you know, we will not only see innovation for consumers, but real innovation will be within the provider space to handle the demand from patients. Those that are informed, from those that are informed decision makers. We're basically already seeing a lot of this through Doctors on Demand, Joyable, Lantern Health, and many other, I would say, startup companies or growth companies are tackling this space as they're seeing that, you know, really the providers are not shifting, so organizations or startups or companies are really trying to tackle a new solution here. The next trend that I would actually hone in on is the approach to individualized treatment based mainly on both genetic and clinical factors, as these have advanced exponentially over the years with lower cost diagnostics to more accurate testing and more advanced technology. Now, genomic tests like 23andMe or others are widely available to better understand your genetic traits. But what I find really exciting in this space is that clinical information, such as information within like an EMR, was once very siloed from lab tests or genomic data. Now it'll be accessible for physicians through a unique prescribing experience through the physician. So data sets now are easier to obtain, and we have made advancements in some reimbursement models that didn't exist before around personalized medicine. Now that EMRs are mandated to be more open, genomic data can be integrated alongside the EMR or within the EMR, creating a more robust view of the patient. So think of that like 360-degree view of the patient. And with this information, providers and care teams can target preventative care specifically to needs, focus on treatment plans that will maximize outcomes and benefits to the right care plan. So as a result of this, we'll have a better understanding of patients' propensity to develop certain health conditions and medicine specifically by ethnicity, and dosing will be specific to that patient. So we will continue in this sector to see reduced costs in sequencing and a focus on more robust ecosystem of software and services that support additional data. Another trend that I see is really on population health. So this is not new. However, both payers and providers and third-party organizations are trying to increase their understanding of how to better manage groups of patients with an increased focus on understanding cost-driving margins and parameters. So for instance, focusing on the patient profile for in and out patients and their associated costs with these different patient profiles. So for instance, high-risk patients among patients with comorbidities, so with multiple high-risk indications and other profiles are huge cost drivers for payers and providers. This is such a massive area that even large tech companies are getting into targeting population health, such as even Salesforce, to industry-specific companies such as Pieces Technologies that recently raised $21 million out of Dallas. And we're trying to tackle this space from other angles as well. However, population health doesn't come without challenges. One of the biggest challenges that I see here is really the access to information within an EMR. So EMRs were built with older technology, not with open source APIs like newer companies today. So as we start to uncover and unravel the information within the EMR, we'll be able to make larger and more specific targets within population health. So watch out in this space for investments from highly specific companies such as a Landmark to broader companies like Salesforce who can handle technology demands and offer the infrastructure. Lastly, I want to talk about the clinical trial and research space. So in order for drugs to be approved, part of the approval is the ability for patients to be tested in usually upwards of thousands of patients. This process of recruitment and management is costing pharma companies and their partners billions of dollars. The recruitment process in clinical trials is really archaic. Patient engagement is lost over time, and patient distance and time becomes an issue for actually retaining patients throughout the study history or study timeline. As a result, about 60% of those patients actually drop out over multi-year studies. So many companies in this space, such as Medrio, Science 37, TrialReach, and others are actually tackling this space across this whole clinical trial and research process. One of the other key advancements that I see is through this Apple Research Kit as probably one of the biggest advancements in this space. It allows for more precise patient recruitment and engagement throughout the course of the research or clinical trials. It's an open platform for organizations to build specific parameters around certain targeted disease states at hand. So, just to kind of recap, there's a lot of information that I covered in terms of a high level in the last about 10 minutes or so. But key areas that I think we should continue to watch over the next couple of years are patient empowerment trends, precision medicine, population health, and clinical trial really design and management. So thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Carla. Really interesting and to the point. So Robin, you know, I've been reading your book, The Patient as CEO, How Technology Empowers a Healthcare Consumer, and it's really an eye-opener. I think my head's going to explode to think about what the future could look like with some of these technologies. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about that. I mean, how is technology really, again, you've been a patient yourself, so how is technology going to empower us consumers of medical services?
Sure. So hi, everyone. I'm Robin Farmanfarmaian. So in addition to working on about 12 or 13 early stage cutting edge medical technology and biotechnology companies, in addition, I am a chronic disease patient, and I've had 43 hospitalizations, 6 major surgeries, and ended up having 3 organs surgically removed for a misdiagnosis. So I talk on patient empowerment through the convergence of accelerating technology. A lot of what that boils down to is really understanding what is coming down the technological pipeline and disrupting medicine over the next 2, 5, and maybe 10 years as a patient, so that you can either gain access to it or what have you, go in and talk to your doctor about it or research it. Because had I known what was happening in technology, if I had waited 3 or 4 years to have my surgeries, I wouldn't have had any of my surgeries, and it would have cut down probably in about 20 to 25 of the hospitalizations, which is a really big deal. So when I'm talking about accelerating or exponential technology, I'm talking about technology that is moving so rapidly right now that it is meeting or exceeding Moore's law, which is a doubling, right? A 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 doubling. And when you start to look at that going out 2 years and looking back 2 years, you don't realize just how fast it's moving. Now, the technologies that are doing this are things like genetic sequencing, right? Sensor technology, artificial intelligence, robotics, 3D printing, and even being able to utilize the power of the crowd, right? And so to delve into just a couple of these, things like sequencing technology, it hit the $995 mark this year, which is an inflection point mark, right? So we're going to start to see a huge number of breakthroughs over the next 2, 5, or 6 years, right? Including things like the microbiome. Now, if you're talking, the microbiome are the colonies of bacteria, fungi, and viruses that live in and on our bodies, right? And it's a symbiotic relationship. We are less than 50% human cells, right? The other 50% are going to be bacterial cells, and we have not been taking this into account when we treat disease or even look at how, the root cause of some of these diseases. So let me give you a couple of examples on sequencing technology and how sequencing the microbiome itself may so dramatically change medicine over the next 5 years that we're not going to be able to recognize it. So 2 examples. I have Crohn's disease. Imagine when I'm feeling really well, I bank my microbiome the same way you bank umbilical cord blood, and I get a transplant back when I'm feeling better. Or this scenario, imagine some of these diseases that we thought were genetic, in fact, turn out to be infectious through the microbiome. And the reason we are going to see, in addition to the fact that sequencing technology is dramatically dropping in price, is because the United States government about 3 weeks ago launched a $500 million initiative around this particular area. So they're trying to get $100 million out of Congress, and then the additional $400 million has already been pledged by private institutions to sequence not only the human microbiome, but the environmental microbiome. So that's just one example. Another really cool forward-looking thing is I'm co-founded a nonprofit called the Organ Preservation Alliance, and what we do is we work with the White House, Department of Defense, DARPA, as well as the cryobiologists and tissue engineers around the world to really catalyze breakthroughs in tissue engineering and cryopreservation. Now, some of our lobbying has resulted in the past, I think it was about 4 days ago, the U.S. government launched a $160 million initiative around organ transplants. Now, that's why I understand like what's happening in tissue engineering, which leads to things like 3D printing of organs, right, which is kind of mind-blowing. Imagine that not only completely reducing the need for a transplant wait list because you could get an organ built out of your own stem cells, but imagine the scenario of instead of having, minor surgery or even some major surgery, say you have a heart attack and you go in there and you're having heart surgery, instead of going in there and patching something up surgically or throwing some medication at it, imagine a world where you just replace your own organs. Every few years, anytime something goes wrong, just switch out your liver, switch out your heart, right? And that will help with massive life extension. So where that technology is today. Right now, we can 3D print tiny little sections of liver and kidney assays, right? And we use them to test for drug toxicity. This is being used in clinical trials. And you notice Carla mentioned, clinical trials are ridiculously expensive. In fact, it can cost about $10 to $12 billion to get one oncology drug to market, and that's $15 billion to get a neuro drug to market. So this is catalyzing, and helping reduce those costs. But when is it going to get into human beings? Well, there's a company called Lung Biotechnologies here in the United States, and what they're doing is taking ghost organs. What that is an organ from a pig or an organ from a human being. You go in there and decellularize it, which means wash away all of the existing cells, but you leave the scaffolding in place, and you leave the vascular system in place. And then you repopulate it with tissue engineering using the recipient patient's stem cells. And then suddenly you have a whole organ that you can then transplant into a patient. They are probably 10 years away from, I'm guessing, from being in human beings, right? They are already working in animals with this particular area. And then eventually, of course, we're trying to get to the point where we're just going to 3D print or tissue engineer an organ from scratch, right? And that's probably on the 20-year mark. The reason that one is so difficult is because the weight of the organ will crush the vascular system, right? Which is why this ghost organ technology may actually be one of the breakthrough things. Do you want me to go into any more, or should we pass it on? There's lots of technologies I can talk about.
Yeah, there's certainly. Well, but maybe you just briefly, you talk a lot about wearable tech in your book. So what's coming down the road? I mean, we can kind of see. I mean, I've got a Fitbit, and we can kind of see what's out there now, but it really pales in comparison to the kind of things that you've talked about here. Could you just touch on that a little bit?
Absolutely. So I call wearable technology an industry in its infancy, right? Right now it's entertainment purposes. It's fun. You have your Fitbit. You can compete with people, gives you feedback loops, gives you, insights into your behavior so that you can modify things, right? Because what gets measured gets monitored, and that can be improved. But the way this is going into the clinical space. Fitbit is actually already in early conversations with the FDA. Companies like HealthWatch out of Israel have a 15-lead EKG compression shirt specifically for clinical use. Companies like Sensoria, they have a consumer-facing device already on the market, but they are working on socks that measure gait for neurodegenerative diseases, right? So we're looking at being able to suddenly sensor up your body. And I'm going to be the first one in line when they start to do the subcutaneous sensors. I'm like, oh my gosh, sensor me up, right? Because you can start to get insights into your health. Right now, I don't wear a Fitbit because it's too difficult to remember to put on. I have to charge the battery. It actually adds that extra step for a patient that we don't want, right? We don't want extra things on our body. As a chronic disease patient, I get IVs enough. And so, I could be in a hospital and strapped down by IVs and a catheter and tubes and maybe a nose tube. And suddenly you put on one more thing and you're like, no, get this thing off of my body. You feel trapped. But the way this is going, which is going to be fantastic, is not just epidermal electronics, which means temporary tattoos that sit on the skin that can stay up, for say 2 weeks at a time. Companies like MC10 have partnered with L'Oreal Cosmetics, which strangely enough has put millions and millions of dollars into R&D in both tissue engineering and wearable technology sensors. But so you can put a sensor on. With the one that they have on the market now, it measures UV radiation, but eventually they're trying to be able to measure glucose in sweat, right? But then you go one step further, subcutaneous, which means sensors under the skin, right? So you can put one, say, a sensor under the skin in your palm of your hand, and not only could it do continuous biometric activity monitoring, so it would have its accelerometer, it would be able to measure potentially glucose into interstitial skin fluid, right? But also even potentially life log and open up smart locks, right? So when you're starting to talk about sensor technology, they can do things beyond just measuring the body and helping you interact with your environment, right? So very, very exciting area. And those three that I talked about, they have already hit their inflection points. Actually, artificial intelligence, sensor technology, and 3D printing on genetic sequencing actually have all recently hit their inflection points. So we are going to see so many dramatic changes over the next 5 years. We're going to look back and say, wow, that's what we did in 2016. It's like being born before the cell phone, right?
Yeah. Well, let me pause on the AI a minute. I noticed that you quoted and cited Vivek Wadhwa in your book a couple of times. He's one of your collaborators, I guess. We had him on a panel on law tech, and he told me that Watson was going to eat law. He was going to replace all of us lawyers at some point. What do you think? Is artificial intelligence going to replace doctors?
Oh, absolutely. And with the AI with lawyers, you know, the world's first AI lawyer was hired this year. Yes. So absolutely. So artificial intelligence is already outperforming physicians in many different areas of medicine. They outperform radiologists. Right now, we are using for certain colonoscopies in some hospitals here in the United States, we use an AI anesthesiologist, which is one of the highest paid medical specialties, and they are being replaced right now already with artificial intelligence. But the way I look at it is the AI is going to be the major decision support software, right? Because I still want that human being, so I want to be able to talk to a physician or a nurse, but the AI is going to take off a lot of the worry around the diagnostics. Right now, AI is already outperforming therapists and psychiatrists in mental health, right? So mental health is going to be a huge change in the next few years. They can already outperform in PTSD and depression. There is a decision support software already called Ellie. And the reason that they can outperform therapists and psychiatrists is because not only does it give you the top 3 probabilities of a diagnosis in general with artificial intelligence, but Ellie analyzes tone of voice, facial expression, and even the very subtle way you string words together over a period of time, whether that is hours, days, weeks, or months, right? Human beings cannot do that. I cannot look at somebody and completely analyze their facial expression in, at the same time as their tone of voice. But an artificial intelligence unit absolutely can. So we are going to see them replace a lot of physician tasks, a lot of nurse tasks, but I still would like to see the human being in that aspect.
Okay. Wow. Well, thanks very much. So from that, we're going to move on to what the investment community thinks about this. And Don, we're going to go ahead and turn the screen over to you, and maybe you could tell us a little bit about yourself and what Life Science Angels is looking at as really good, promising investment sectors in health tech.
Certainly, thank you, Roger. And so just and thank you to the earlier panelists there. I had some great overview of the industry. I'm going to focus a little bit more on some of the specifics that I see in company applications. There's certain issues that rise again and again, so it's a little bit of a different direction. With Life Science Angels, which was rated as the #1 angel group nationwide by CB Insights, we have a specific focus that I'm working on in the digital health sector. And also I have a brief overview paper on the industry, as well as David Fagan has a population health paper that will be posted at the Life Science Angels website. We're just revamping the apply to funding section, so it might be a week or two here, but there'll be links to those articles if people are interested. So a quick background on me. I come from entrepreneurial roots. Back in the early 80s, I wrote the software for several of the major psychological assessment instruments, such as the Myers-Briggs, the Strong Interest Inventory, California Personality Inventory, and others. At the similar time, I teamed up with a professor out of the psychiatry department at Stanford, and we co-authored a test anxiety intervention program called Coping with Tests. That was studied at Fordham University and found to outperform conventional group therapy, and was published by Consulting Psychologist Press. And then I subsequently founded a publishing company in healthcare, ran that for 15 years until its acquisition. So out of the numerous applications that we get, and I have reviewed over more than 1,000 health tech related company applications. Which are the ones that really rise to the top of the pile, the ones that really get paid attention to? And that's where I'd really like to address today, and it's the ones that really address some of the problems that are ongoing. Of course, it's a cliche at this point about the importance of the team, but that's some cliches are true. It's absolutely paramount. And what's interesting to me is that because there's so many different industries coming into the health tech space, and people out of pure software, people out of hardware, people out of healthcare. Sometimes the healthcare part can get forgotten, and so we'll see some companies that will be coming into the clinic and they have no one with healthcare experience on their team, and that's a real that's a real problem. I mean, our healthcare system still has a lot of arcane aspects to it, and it really takes someone that understands that. The other thing in digital health or health tech is that it's really, from an investor standpoint, it's much more about market risk than it is usually about technology or regulatory risk. Oftentimes the software, the technologies aren't rocket science or dramatic new inventions. It's really the way it's being applied in healthcare. It's around the business model, and it's around how the sales and marketing are going to scale. And so having sales and marketing expertise is also really critical as part of the company team. So you want to make sure that someone, you know, we look for whether somebody's launched a product or service in your target market, you know, has there been some experience with the proposed sales channel, really what that understanding is. So these are just the, at a high level, are some of the challenges that I see that occur over and over again for health tech or digital health companies. So a real key one is, and you would think this would be straightforward, but just who is the customer? And I'll give kind of a quick example of a company that worked with and actually funded has a application for engaging women early in pregnancy into the healthcare system, and there's really good data to show that if women are engaged early, that there's a much lower rate of complications at birth. So there's a tremendous benefit for the women that have just become pregnant. However, the business model is really from the insurance side, and it's really the reduction of birth complications that's causing massive savings for the insurer. And so really their customer, they have to have a value proposition for the insurance company. That's the entity that's paying them, and they have to have a strong economic argument for them, but they also need to have a value proposition for the patient. And they really need to have the maybe patient's a misnomer, but really need to have the women engaged with the healthcare system, and there's a whole engagement value proposition that needs to be made there. So really identifying the customer, where the money's going to come from, not just where value is being delivered, is absolutely critical. So then another big part then is getting out of the arm waving and really looking at customer validation and different levels of customer validation, and how compelling the validation is for an investor. So at the very beginning, it may be that you just have customer interviews that are really helping define your system, your service, your product, and those can be are exceedingly important. It's exceedingly important in the company development. Then the next level is when you actually have a minimum viable product. You're out in some sort of a free pilot. That has some validation there, but even better is a paid pilot where you have customers that are actually paying to have you pilot this. But you know, pilots also, you have to be careful to have defined endpoints. There's a lot of companies that have just died in the pilot stage. So even more compelling is if you have early adopters, actual sales to some of the lead institutions, and then it may be the next level up would be you might have deployment in a couple of hospitals, and then of course a full deployment system-wide or across multiple systems. So there's no right or wrong along this scale, but I think maybe you can get a feel for how each one becomes more and more powerful, and the further along that you can get, the more interesting it is for the investor. And the other thing on the customer validation is that it's important to know how you're going to test your hypothesis on your sales strategy before betting the farm, because there's an awful lot of adjustments that go on during the sales process. Another key issue is that how a system will fit into the clinical workflows. And as you can probably tell here, my orientation and focus really is within the healthcare system. I'm not a consumer apps guy, really where the strength of expertise really is within the practice of medicine and the healthcare system. And so in doing solutions there, some of the issues are whether or not there's going to have to be a whole separate sign-in. Is this going to be a system that rides alongside, say, the EMR system? Well, the more systems that a physician or nurse needs to sign into, you know, that's a higher threshold. It uses up time unnecessarily. That's really difficult. On the other hand, as we've talked about with data silos, you know, getting full integration can be challenging. But so that's an important issue to address. You know, ultimately, there has to be a minimal disruption in clinical workflows. And probably the most important question is the one of, you know, are you going to change the practice of medicine? You know, changing the practice of medicine is extraordinarily difficult. I think that I mean, clearly we're having a whole disruption in our healthcare system, but to actually change the way a doctor practices medicine has often been the kiss of death for a startup company. So this is moving on here is really in building barriers to entry. This can be quite tricky in the health tech and digital health area. As I talked about, we're oftentimes you really don't have patents or technologies that are really protectable. You have to find competitive barriers elsewhere. So one thing that that we'll hear about a lot is that people talk about a first mover advantage, that they're going to be first out into the field, and that can be an advantage. You can really get some good lead time if there's no one else out doing what it is that you're doing, and you don't have direct competitors. But also, when you do that, you're breaking the trail, and that takes an awful lot of energy. It takes money. Oftentimes, you have to educate the market, which can be a long, expensive process. And then after you expend all that work, and you can kind of see this little wolf down here is even panting to break his trail. So you get the trail broken, and then what happens is you have everyone else follows right along in your heels. They see what you do, they improve on it, they can move more quickly, and so first mover is a tough advantage to make sustainable. The one way that it can be is if you just have massive amounts of money going in to go through massive scaling. That's not my sweet spot. So really, one of the areas that there's really a tremendous amount of power in both building your system and in making for both effective and for competitive barriers is really in the data. It's really important if you're coming into the healthcare system at all that you're able to prove the effectiveness of what it is that you're doing, that it's just not arm waving. And oftentimes, depending upon what your application is, it's not only proving the effectiveness in the short term, but also in the long term as well. So if you take something like, say, a system where you're going to address weight control, most interventions can get short-term weight loss, but is that going to persist 2 years from now, or will all the weight be regained? So having good data on the effectiveness is quite critical. The other thing is to really think through what the customer ROI is going to be. When the customer, and again, I'm talking about institutions and organizations, so when they come in to purchase your service or product, where is their return going to be for spending that money? Believe me, if you're selling solutions into the hospital, at some point you're going to end up with the chief financial officer of the hospital in the room, and you really need to have your ducks in a row for the financial argument there. The other parts of data that can really help with competitive barriers is, for instance, with the effectiveness data. If you have several years worth of effectiveness data and a competitor, has a trial with 20 people in it, that's a huge competitive advantage, and it can take years for the competitor to catch up. So really good data sets can be huge. There's also, with the data, the raw data itself belongs to the institution, it belongs to the patients, but oftentimes the analytics or the intelligence that you're extracting from that can be part of what your system is, and so for an institution to switch or go to a competitor, the switching costs can be very high, and that can be another important barrier to competition. And really, all of these is that there's not one killer barrier. It's really an assembly of several barriers, but it's important to be able to articulate these. You'd be surprised at the number of companies that don't even address it. And then finally, in talking about data, is that there's a favorite expression, too much data, not enough information. So out of the analysis, you need to have actionable information. And I like to apply the same test that doctors apply when ordering a diagnostic test. And so to order a diagnostic test, it can't just be the information and be nice to know. It has to be that the information from the test will somehow change the course of therapy. So I really look at this and say, okay, by possessing this information that your system provides, how is that going to change things? How is that going to change what it is that you're going to do, what the institution's going to do? So one thing that is an emerging trend here is initially in the health tech digital health space, there was a real avoidance of the FDA. But there's a recognition now that actually going through the FDA can be advantageous. It can both provide credibility and lead time, and also becomes a temporary barrier that again buys time, which is worth a lot from competitors. And of course, the downside is that it's costly, takes time, and it also takes effort and focus from the company. So this is really what we're looking for, is that you want to have an unfair competitive advantage in the market. You want to have pricing power. This provides sustainability and allows you to scale without having spending all your efforts at everyone nipping at your heels. So with that, I hope that's been helpful, and I'd be happy to turn this back over to Roger.
Well, thanks very much, Don. So it's good to hear the perspective, the investor perspective on what's hot and what's investable. So from now, we're going to turn back to, Andy, we heard Carla talk about what Salesforce is doing in the space, and I know you come to this space from a little different perspective, and you've had a lot of different roles, but currently, I know you're in the health and life sciences group at Intel. So we've got your slides up. We're on the first slide, so why don't you go ahead and take it away, and you can direct us.
Perfect. Thanks, Roger. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, we hear you fine.
As Roger mentioned, my name's Andy Bartley. I'm a senior solution architect in the health and life sciences group at Intel. I'm fairly new to Intel. My background's about 15 years in the healthcare industry. Started as a biological engineer designing surgical equipment for Stryker, specifically in the sports medicine space. If you've ever had your ACL replaced or rotator cuff replaced with Stryker equipment. Probably worked on that. After medical devices, spent a couple of years in the venture industry, sourcing and evaluating and investing in early stage healthcare, life science and medical device deals. And then most recently have been co-founder of a couple companies in the healthcare space. So did a company called Algorithms.io, which provided machine learning for consumer wearable devices. So think, the data streaming off your Fitbit or from your consumer wearable, we would take that for companies and give them context. So based on that data stream, turn that into an actionable insight. Here's what your user is actually doing with your device, and then use that data to provide personalized recommendations and suggestions to those users based on their activity with the device. Most recently was head of product and chief operating officer at a company called NurseGrid. NurseGrid is the largest personal scheduling platform for nurses in the United States. It's think of a LinkedIn meets scheduling for nurses. So they're able to take their schedule with them on their mobile phone and trade shifts and see who they work with when they go into work. So come at healthcare from a number of different angles. In my role today at Intel, it's kind of an interesting role. It sort of puts all that to work. So what I really do is work and act as a bridge between Intel and partners and solution providers out in the broader healthcare ecosystem to pull together different pieces into complete solutions. So think, a mix of hardware and software combined to solve a real problem for a healthcare customer. Intel enjoys a pretty unique role in the healthcare ecosystem in that we do not sell anything directly to our health and life science customers. So, I work globally with healthcare providers, with government trusts, with payers, and with pharma. But in those conversations, Intel does not show up with the PO in hand trying to sell product. Really, the role of our organization is to create new solutions that incorporate the latest technologies for those different healthcare users. So I focus most of my time on the inpatient acute care setting globally. So really working with kind of regions around the world and looking at how do you improve both that experience when a patient's in the hospital and then extend that experience out into the community. And one of the kind of the big global trends that we follow right now that is a problem in the U.S. and even more so outside of the U.S. is access to high quality care and consistent care across different care settings. And really what's driving a lot of that is the traditional inpatient infrastructure, so think your hospitals, is not keeping up with demand for healthcare services. And there's a number of reasons for that. There's aging population, there's increase in chronic diseases, there's a lot of the trends and things going on in the market that the previous panelists covered. But the bottom line is, globally, healthcare is undergoing a transformation that will require it to be able to deliver high quality care experiences in new settings. Might be the home, might be ambulatory clinics, it might be shared community centers, it might be the kiosk at Walgreens, but all of these new care models are evolving, and this is not a phenomenon just in the United States. So, in this role, I'll talk about a couple of the other trends that we look at, Roger, and we'll look at, the next slide and just talk about some of those. So maybe we can shift over to the next slide. I'll talk about some of the key trends that we're focused on at Intel, and then, reserve a couple minutes here at the end for questions from the audience. So the first reform, healthcare reform, payment reform, this was mentioned earlier, the move to value-based care. Won't reiterate what the previous panelists talked about there. The one thing I would add that we're seeing around healthcare reform and payment reform is that this is driving a sort of an unprecedented amount of M&A in the healthcare industry. So as large provider organizations are required to submit payments based on value and outcomes, it becomes more important to integrate the different service lines into a cohesive experience. So things like primary care, you now want to take into account what's happening at the primary care level because that can potentially impact your readmissions into your inpatient acute care setting. And so we're seeing a lot of M&A happen in the U.S. We're seeing a lot of M&A and mergers and growth in new kind of what healthcare systems look like in other geographies as well. And a lot of that drives complexity around technology. So these integrations and these acquisitions generally incorporate new health records. They have new clinical systems. And so bringing all of this together to get a cohesive view of the patient is a big challenge, the technology integration. And so that's another kind of downstream impact of this healthcare reform and payment reform that we're seeing opportunity for new companies to emerge to help with this clinical integration across disparate provider organizations that end up getting merged. So some interesting opportunities around that. Personalization of the healthcare industry, talked a lot about personalized medicine. I tend to look at this space, given my role, kind of 2 to 3 years out into the future. So some of the big problems right now around personalized medicine are the underlying infrastructure. So we're talking about generating massive amounts of data with genomics. And how do you store that data? How do you make it accessible? How do you simply transfer that data from the lab where the genomic testing is being done into the clinical setting so it can even be incorporated to the EMR? And those are big problems that are in the market today that have not been solved. So though, to reach this vision of personalized medicine, there are quite a few underlying infrastructure and technology challenges that need to be accomplished and need to be overcome today. And again, we're seeing a lot of innovation and kind of new companies emerging around this that are looking at kind of solving some of those core problems of collecting and transporting the data and then also making it usable then at the endpoint for the clinician. Patient and member engagement. This is an area that we're spending a fair amount of time on now, and really the idea, there's a couple ways to kind of slice and dice this, but the idea of better engaging patients in their care in a more holistic way. We talked about that a little earlier with wearables and some of the impact that wearables have had. One of the things that we work a lot with is sort of supporting more clinical research around wearables and different in-home clinical models to support ongoing patient engagement. Adherence to care plans is very important. It's been shown in numerous studies that better engaging patients in their care plans leads to better outcomes. It leads to lower costs. It leads to improved access to care by keeping folks out of those inpatient care settings. So the value is known, but engaging patients in their care is a difficult thing. Folks with chronic conditions, there's a lot of times, mental blockers and human factors that get in the way of those individuals wanting to really get engaged with their care plan. And so doing a lot of work right now around how can technology help make that a more seamless experience? How can technology help to make that a more value-added experience for the patient? And how do you incorporate the technology and the adherence to your care plan into the activities and the events that you partake in every day, so it's not an additional step that you have to take? I think we talked about that earlier. Adding the wearable onto my wrist, it's another thing I have to do. And when I'm dealing with the mental stress of being in a state where I have a chronic condition, it's difficult to maintain adherence to that over time. So looking at new ways of improving user experience and user-centered design around technology for engaging patients. Healthcare security, talked a little bit about that. Folks, especially here in the United States, have probably seen in the news in your local markets some example of healthcare security breach. The Department of Health and Human Services is now requiring that all healthcare data breaches that impact 500 patients or more to be posted on a public website. So if you're ever curious if your provider has had a breach, you can go onto that website, search HSS or HHS security breach wall of shame, and you'll be able to find it and search through those providers and see if there's been a breach. But there's a lot of transparency around healthcare security. Healthcare records, so think of your health record, is worth, depending on the data in there, 10x to 100x more than stealing a credit card file. So that's the black market value, is anywhere from $50 to several $100s for a healthcare record versus $5 to $10 for a credit card file on the black market. So those are really the economics driving the continued advancements and breaches against healthcare systems. As a result, healthcare organizations are adopting new compute models. So they're moving to things like virtualization, where they actually do all of the processing back in the data center, and the edge devices, think the tablets or the laptops or the two-in-ones, are actually fairly empty shells that just make a call back to that back-end data center to do all the compute. So they remove all the data from those devices. So healthcare security breaches are driving pretty massive shifts in compute models and in technology investments through healthcare organizations. And we're working closely with them to help address those concerns. And then finally, the last point, I won't spend too much time on this today because I think most of our audience today is from the United States, but in the US, I think a lot of times, we can take for granted some of the digital capabilities that we have in today's healthcare system. When you look at healthcare systems across the world, many are very, very far behind the US. And the example I like to give is if you have prostate cancer in the UK today, there is no phone number to call. There is no website you go to schedule your appointments. There's a process that involves about 21 letters mailed back and forth in the mail to get your appointment scheduled and to get your claims set up through the government. So digital healthcare, patient records, access to some of the online patient portals that we enjoy a lot of times here in the U.S., those have not been widely deployed in many other markets. And so we spend a lot of our time, taking the best practices from the United States and working with organizations and governments outside the U.S. to help them implement those and bring their healthcare systems up to the point where they do have reliable information and access to digital records. So I'll stop there. Roger, I know we're just about out of time, and maybe we can grab a couple of questions before we sign off.
Okay, thanks very much, Andy. So we have one very specific question here. It's about the future of epidermal electronic wearables. And Robin, you talked a little bit about this. Maybe, I guess, first of all, if you could define what that is first, and then what's your view on where that's going?
Sure. So what that is sensors that essentially just stick onto your skin for a period of time, whether that is a day or 2 weeks. And in fact, they're here. So MC10 already has something called the biostamp on the market. I believe it's quite expensive. It's not something that a consumer would go out and buy right away, but it is already on the market. So we do have epidermal electronics, and their partnership with L'Oreal, they are expected to release the one that monitors UV radiation. It's a little tiny heart-sized one, about the size of your thumbnail, and that will be released by the end of the year.
Okay. The other panelists have a view on that, electronic wearables and where that's going. Don, would you invest in that?
So there's a number of things that we would certainly take a look at on that. So the kinds of things that we would be concerned about is how it's adhered to the skin, what are the potentials for skin reactions, and how the information would be used. And of course, then who's going to pay for it? Certainly in the one that's existing that's quite expensive, I'm guessing it's probably more in trials or institutional payments. But so those would be the key questions that we would have.
Yeah, I'd say, Roger, from looking at that sort of model, we'll call more of an invasive type wearable device. There's a lot of potential there, and if you look at some of the cardiology studies done with Medtronic, the data that they were able to collect with implanted wearables was able to drive pretty significant results in the path of cardiovascular care, where previous studies with external placed wearables had really failed for years to generate any significant clinical outcome improvement. So, we think that there's a lot of opportunity for both external and implanted wearables to really, at the end of the day, collect the right data that can be used to drive meaningful outcomes versus some of the wearables that are on the market today.
Okay. So, we got a question here about investment in early stage as well as social impact. And, Carla and Andy, I know both of you have been in the startup world previously, and now you're both with very large companies. And Don has said that this is a tough space to invest in if it's going to require tons and tons of money before you get to market. Is this an area that that you think you might see some innovation starting at the startup level, or is it more big company stuff? What do you think?
Yeah, Roger, I'll answer that. So I think it's interesting, and it goes back to what I believe Dom mentioned earlier about the team in the startup space. And what I saw was there's a lot of folks that that are getting into the healthcare space that haven't had real experience when it has to do with the hospital or the provider space. So let's say they're, targeting a specific area in healthcare. It's really important to have someone that has had the exact expertise in the area that you're trying to target in order for you to be successful. So, I think the most important thing when kind of looking at startups or even getting involved in a startup is, do you have that expertise? What kind of knowledge or background does your team have in that space? And if not, it's important to bring those folks on board, because right now, even working with providers and payers specifically here, it's still very complex, and the market, yes, is ripe for innovation, but it's slow moving. There's a lot of complexities, and if you don't have that experience, there's a lot of room for failure. And startup companies, oftentimes don't have the capacity to learn over years of product market fit. It's really important to get out of the gate pretty quickly, and so with that experience in-house is very important. And in terms of working, as I believe either Andy or Ron mentioned as well, now kind of paving the way if you're backed by a large organization. So Salesforce has recently gotten into the healthcare space, and they're able to do that because they're backed by a large financial backing. And so although we've made some strides in this space, they're able to take that risk because of the financial backing that we have. So just kind of a few thoughts there on this particular topic.
Okay, well,
yeah,
thanks.
I'd second that. Carla's comments. Companies that come in with too much tech and not enough health, have a hard time making those adjustments. The only other point maybe I'd add to that too is, coming in as a startup with the right mentality to innovating in this space. Have worked with a lot of startup companies in my time in venture, and have been through some accelerator programs as an entrepreneur. And from what I've seen, the companies that come in with the mentality that the healthcare system needs to go through a transformation and needs to change and get better, versus the entrepreneurs that come in with the mentality that the system is broken and I'm going to fix it. The former tend to do better, and there's a subtle shift in mentality that happens in how you end up collaborating with your potential pilot customers or your initial deployment users. There's more of a collaborative approach that comes in with the mentality that, hey, the system today works. There's some inefficiencies, yes, but really what we're looking at is a change in how healthcare needs to be deployed. So let's work with you to help you get better, versus you don't know what you're doing, it's broken, and you see entrepreneurs will come in and give that kind of pitch, and all the healthcare administrators or healthcare practitioners in the room kind of roll their eyes when folks go down that tangent. So I just kind of encourage companies to come in with that collaborative mindset, and let's work together to make it better, versus it's a broke, I'm going to fix it kind of mindset.
So I think that's well said, and if I can jump in for just a moment for a clarification, when I was talking about gobs of money, that really was more for the where you're just relying on scale for first mover, often in a consumer facing. We just funded a company doing clinical decision support in radiology. We're looking seriously at a company that is improving communications between the ambulance and the ER. And streamlining that process to fit in the workflows. Have another company we're looking at that actually is a wearable for early detection of heart failure monitoring, where they have some pretty remarkable accuracy non-invasively on things like peripheral edema. So there's a lot of opportunities. It doesn't necessarily take where you have to back up the truck in order to fund them.
All right, well, thanks very much, Don, for that clarification. And I'd like to thank our panelists. We're a little over time, and I want to be respectful of the panelists' time. Thank you for participating in our webinar. I'd like to remind the attendees that this webinar has been recorded. You can find the materials and a recording on the Royse University webinar site. You will also find it available for download as a podcast in the iTunes Store, and it is available also on the Royse Law YouTube site. And for those of you in the attendance whose questions we didn't get to, if you do have questions, feel free to email me and I'll forward them on to the panelists later. And just a reminder, we have a couple more in our series coming up before our spring series is over. We have crowdfunding for equity on June 24, that's this Thursday. We have water tech next week on June 29, and a non-technology topic next week, foreign investment in U.S. real estate on June 30, and that will conclude our webinar series for the spring. So again, thank you members for attending. Thank you panelists for a very interesting discussion. And with that, we're going to conclude the webinar.